Is that engine dead, or are you just not listening to it? The voice cut through the chaos on the carrier deck, low and steady, almost swallowed by the constant hum of generators and the distant crash of waves against steel. No one answered. They were too busy staring at screens, at diagnostics that insisted everything was fine, while 20 feet of hardened naval engineering refused to move. The engine sat there in silence, a massive, unmoving heart in the center of the deck, its housing warm under the late afternoon sun, its status lights glowing a confident green that felt almost insulting. Ryan Cole wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove, leaving a smear of grease across his skin. 6 hours. 6 hours of running tests, recalibrating sensors, cross-checking systems that all pointed to one impossible conclusion. Nothing was wrong, and yet nothing worked. Around him, engineers moved faster now, their voices overlapping, sharp, defensive, each one trying to prove control over a situation that had quietly slipped out of their hands an hour ago. Laptops were open on portable racks, cables snaking across the deck, software dashboards flickering with perfect readings. Pressure stable. Fuel lines clear. Ignition sequence nominal. Every line of data told the same story. The engine should have been running. It wasn't. Lieutenant Jason Mercer stood just behind them, arms crossed tight against his chest, posture rigid with the kind of authority that hadn't yet been tested by failure. His eyes moved from one engineer to another, searching for certainty and finding none. "We are minutes behind schedule," he said, his tone clipped, controlled, but carrying a sharp edge that made the nearest technician flinch. "This launch window does not wait." Ryan exhaled slowly, crouching beside the engine housing, his hand resting against the metal as if he could force it to respond. It felt wrong. Not broken, not damaged, just wrong. He shook his head and stood up, frustration tightening his jaw. "We've checked everything twice," he said, louder now, as if volume could replace confidence. "There is no mechanical fault." The statement hung in the air, hollow, because the engine was still silent. A gust of ocean wind swept across the deck, rattling loose tools and tugging at uniforms, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and fuel. At the edge of the work zone, just beyond the tangle of cables and equipment, a man stood alone. He hadn't spoken again. He hadn't moved closer. He simply watched. His jacket was old, navy blue faded into something softer by years of sun and use, the fabric worn thin at the cuffs. In his hand, he held a small leather pouch, darkened and creased, its edges rounded smooth from decades of being opened and closed. No badge, no clearance tag. No one had stopped him, mostly because no one had noticed him long enough to care. Lieutenant Mercer finally did. His gaze locked onto the figure with a brief flicker of irritation. An interruption. An anomaly. "Sir," Mercer called out, stepping forward, his voice formal but stripped of warmth. "This is a restricted operations area." The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the engine, pale and steady, as if the noise, the movement, the urgency around him simply didn't exist. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "You're reading it wrong," he said. Ryan let out a short, incredulous breath, turning halfway toward him. "Excuse me." The man shifted his gaze just enough to meet Ryan's eyes, calm, unhurried. "It's not broken," he added. "It's just not being heard." A few of the engineers exchanged glances, the tension on the deck twisting into something sharper, edged with disbelief. Ryan gave a dry, humorless laugh. "We've got 12 certified engineers, 3 diagnostic systems, and real-time telemetry," he said, gesturing toward the glowing screens. "We're not exactly guessing." The man nodded once, as if acknowledging the effort, not the conclusion. "No," he said softly. "You're just asking the wrong questions." Silence pressed in for half a second, heavy and uncomfortable, before Mercer stepped forward again, authority snapping back into place. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away," he said. "Now." The man didn't argue. He didn't move either. His gaze returned to the engine, steady as ever, as if waiting for something no one else could see. And somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the hum of systems and the rising pressure of a mission slipping out of schedule, the silence of that engine felt deeper than before, like it was holding its breath. Ryan Cole stared at the old man for a long second, the kind of look reserved for someone who had just said something that sounded simple but felt completely out. of place. Around them, the deck noise returned in waves. Technicians shifting positions, tools clinking, someone calling out updated readings that still did not explain anything. Lieutenant Mercer took another step forward, closing the distance, his boots striking the deck with sharp, deliberate intent. "Sir, you are interfering with an active operation," he said, voice firm now, practiced authority filling the space between them. "I will ask you one more time to step back." The man finally turned his head fully, meeting Mercer's gaze without any trace of challenge, without any need to prove anything. "You can ask," he said quietly. "It will not change what the engine is doing." That answer landed wrong. Not disrespectful, not aggressive, just certain. Ryan felt something tighten in his chest, a flicker of irritation that came from hearing confidence without credentials. He gestured toward the open diagnostics screen beside him, its green indicators glowing like a quiet accusation. "Everything here says the system is functioning within normal parameters," he said, slower this time, as if explaining to someone who had missed the obvious. "There is nothing to fix." The man nodded once, acknowledging the data, then shifted his gaze back to the engine housing. "That is the problem," he said. "You are looking for something broken." A technician nearby let out a short laugh, quickly stifled when Mercer's eyes snapped in his direction. The tension stretched tighter. Tom was moving, even if the engine was not. Somewhere above them, a signal light blinked from amber toward warning red, a silent reminder that delays had consequences no one wanted to explain. Ryan exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair, frustration starting to override patience. "Then what exactly are we supposed to be looking for?" he asked, the question edged with challenge. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a single step forward, just enough to close the distance to the engine without crossing into the cluster of cables and equipment. His hand hovered over the metal surface, not touching it yet, as if waiting for the right moment. "A disagreement," he said finally, "between what it is told and what it feels." Ryan blinked, processing the words, then shook his head with a faint, incredulous smile. "It is a machine," he said. "It does not feel anything." The man's fingers lightly brushed the surface of the housing. The contact was brief, almost casual, but something in his posture shifted, subtle and immediate, like he had just confirmed a suspicion no one else knew to have. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in strain, but in focus. "It responds," he corrected. Silence followed that. Not complete silence, but enough of a pause that the surrounding noise seemed to dim for a second. Mercer stepped in again, his patience thinning. "That is enough," he said. "Step away from the equipment." But Ryan did not echo the order this time. He was watching the man's hand, the way it had moved, the way it had paused. There was no hesitation in it. No guesswork. Just recognition. It unsettled him more than the words. "What do you think you are seeing?" Ryan asked, quieter now. The man withdrew his hand and reached into the worn leather pouch at his side. The snap of the old clasp was soft, almost lost under the hum of the deck, but it carried a weight that made Ryan's attention lock onto it. From inside, the man pulled out a small, aged tool, metal dulled by time, edges worn smooth from years of use. It looked out of place among the modern equipment, almost primitive. Mercer let out a breath of disbelief. "You cannot be serious," he said. "We are not doing this." The man turned the tool over once in his fingers, as if remembering its balance, then looked back at the engine. "You said everything is working," he murmured. "Then why is it quiet?" No one answered. Because that was the one question none of their systems had been able to explain. And for the first time in 6 hours, Ryan realized he did not actually know. The wind shifted across the deck, sharper now, carrying a low whistle through the exposed edges of the engine housing, a sound so faint it barely registered unless you were listening for it. The man was. He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing, the old tool resting loosely between his fingers as if it had always belonged there. Ryan watched him with growing unease, the earlier irritation giving way to something harder to define. It was not belief. Not yet. But it was no longer dismissal. "You are hearing something," Ryan said, more statement than question. The man did not look at him. "Not hearing," he replied. "Not exactly." He crouched, slowly beside the engine, movements deliberate, unhurried, as if time had not been pressing down on the entire deck for the last 6 hours. Around him, the engineers hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene or step back, caught between protocol and curiosity. Lieutenant Mercer did not hesitate. "That is enough," he said sharply. "Step away from that system immediately." The man paused, one knee against the deck, then glanced up just briefly, his expression calm, almost patient. "You can stop me," he said, "but it will not fix it." Mercer's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he would give the order, like he would have two sailors physically remove the man and restore control to a situation that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. But Ryan spoke first. "Wait," he said, the word cutting across the tension before he had time to reconsider it. Mercer turned sharply toward him. "Lieutenant, we are out of time," Ryan added, his voice lower now, steadier. "We have tried everything that makes sense." The admission hung in the air, heavier than any argument. Mercer held his gaze for a long second, weighing authority against reality, then stepped back half a pace. Not approval, not acceptance, but not interference either. It was enough. The man returned his attention to the engine, placing his hand flat against the metal again, this time holding it there. His eyes closed for just a fraction of a second. The deck, the voices, the pressure, all of it seemed to fall away around him. The hum of the ship deepened, stretching into something older, something familiar. Heat, vibration, a different deck, years ago, rolling under a darker sky. Steam rising in thick waves, visibility cut down to a few feet. A younger pair of hands gripping the same kind of metal, steady despite the conditions, feeling for a rhythm that no instrument could measure. Listening not with ears, but with memory. The moment passed, but it left something behind in his posture, a certainty that had not been there before. He opened his eyes and leaned slightly closer to the panel Ryan had been working near for hours. "There," he said quietly, tapping once with the tip of the tool, not forcefully, just enough to mark the spot. Ryan frowned and stepped in, following the gesture. It looked normal. Flush. Sealed. Within tolerance. Exactly like everything else. That had failed to explain the silence. "That panel is within spec," Ryan said, though the confidence in his voice had thinned. The man shook his head faintly. "It is perfect," he said. "That is why it is wrong." A technician beside them shifted, uncertain. "Sensors behind that plate are reading stable," he offered, almost defensively. The man nodded. "Because they are not reading what matters." Ryan crouched down now, closer than before, his eyes scanning the seam of the panel, the bolts, the alignment. He had looked at it before, more than once. But now he was looking again, and something about that felt different. "What do you think is behind it?" Ryan asked. The man did not answer right away. He adjusted his grip on the worn tool, then positioned it carefully against the edge of the panel, not prying, not forcing, just testing. "Not what the system thinks," he said. And for the first time, Ryan felt it clearly. Not the problem. The possibility that everything they trusted had missed it. Ryan held his position beside the panel, his eyes tracing the fine edge where metal met metal, the seam so clean it almost disappeared under the afternoon light. He had seen it before. He knew he had. But now it felt different, like looking at something familiar from an angle that made it impossible to ignore. The man adjusted the tool again, applying the slightest pressure against the corner, not forcing entry, just listening through contact. The deck seemed to quiet around them, not because the noise had stopped, but because every person within 10 feet had unconsciously stopped moving. Lieutenant Mercer noticed it too. The shift, the attention. He did not like it. Authority was slipping, not loudly, but quietly, in a way that was harder to control. "You are about to breach a sealed component," Mercer said, his voice tight, controlled. "That requires authorization." The man did not look up. "It requires understanding," he replied. Ryan felt the words settle somewhere deeper than he expected. Not as defiance. As fact. A technician behind him shifted uneasily. "If we break that seal, we are going to have to report it," he said, his tone cautious, as if reminding everyone of the consequences that still mattered in a system built on procedure. The man gave a small nod. "Then you will report that you found the problem," he said. Simple. Direct. No hesitation. Ryan exhaled slowly, then made a decision that felt larger than the action itself. "Open it," he said. Mercer turned sharply. "You do not have that authority." Ryan did not look at him. "Neither does the engine," he replied. The words were not disrespectful. They were tired. Honest. Mercer's jaw tightened again, but he did not step forward this time. He watched. The man shifted his grip, then with a precise movement, used the tool to ease one corner of the panel just enough to break the seal. The sound was subtle, a faint click that seemed too small to carry so much weight. As the panel loosened, a thin breath of air escaped from within, almost imperceptible, but enough for the man to pause. He leaned in slightly, listening again, feeling again. Then he gently pulled the panel back. Ryan leaned closer, eyes narrowing as the interior came into view. At first glance, everything looked exactly as the diagnostics had promised. Clean. Intact. No visible damage. No loose components. No obvious fault. There is nothing here, the technician said quietly, almost relieved. The man did not respond immediately. He reached in carefully, not touching everything, only moving past what did not matter, his fingers navigating with a certainty that did not come from diagrams or schematics. Then he stopped. There, he said. Ryan followed his hand, squinting. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. A line. A slight misalignment deep within the assembly, no more than a fraction of an inch, enough to redirect pressure in a way no external sensor could detect. Ryan's breath caught. That should not be possible, he said under his breath. The man gave a faint, almost amused exhale. It is, he said, because it happened before. He adjusted the component gently, not forcing it, just guiding it back into place with the worn tool, the motion smooth, practiced, as if he had done it not once, but many times under far worse conditions. The deck held its breath with him. When he finished, he did not announce it. He did not step back dramatically. He simply withdrew his hand, set the panel loosely in place, and looked at Ryan. Now, he said. Ryan hesitated for half a second, then turned toward the control station. His hand hovered over the restart. Command. For the first time all day, he did not trust the screen. He trusted the silence that had changed. He pressed the command. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then a low vibration rolled through the deck, subtle at first, then building, deep and steady, like a heartbeat returning after being gone too long. The engine came alive. Not violently, not suddenly, but undeniably. Conversations stopped mid-word. Tools froze in midair. The hum of the ship shifted as power flowed back into alignment. Ryan stood there, staring at the readings as they finally matched reality. Behind him, no one spoke, because no one knew what to say. And in the middle of it all, the man simply closed the worn leather pouch, as if the moment required nothing more. For a moment, no one moved. The low, steady rumble of the engine spread through the carrier deck, vibrating up through boots, through steel, through the air itself, a sound that every person there knew by instinct, but had not heard all day. It was not just noise. It was confirmation. Ryan Cole slowly lowered his hand from the control panel, his eyes fixed on the live data streaming across the screen. This time it matched. Every reading aligned perfectly with what he could feel under his feet. Pressure stabilized. Rotation consistent. Output nominal. Everything was exactly where it should have been hours ago. But it was not the data that held him still. It was the realization that none of it had mattered until that moment. Behind him, one of the technicians let out a quiet breath he did not realize he had been holding. Another straightened up, staring at the engine as if expecting it to stop again, as if this correction might somehow undo itself. It did not. It held. Lieutenant Mercer stood rigid, his arms still crossed, but the posture had changed. It was no longer control. It was containment. His eyes shifted from the engine to the open panel, then to the man who had already stepped back from it, who had already closed the worn leather pouch and slipped it back to his side, as if the task had been routine, expected, finished long before anyone else understood it. You adjusted a pressure misalignment that was not flagged by any system, Mercer said finally, his voice measured, careful. It was not a question. It was an attempt to frame what had just happened in terms he could accept. The man gave a small nod. It was not where your system was looking, he said. Ryan turned toward him fully now, the earlier skepticism gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. How did you know? He asked. The man met his gaze, and for a brief second, there was something behind his eyes that did not belong to the present deck, something older, something carried. Because it sounded familiar, he said. That answer did not satisfy logic. It did not fit into any training manual or technical briefing. But Ryan did not challenge it, because it felt true in a way he could not explain. A call crackled over the deck communication system, sharp and immediate, cutting through the moment. Engineering status report, the voice demanded. Ryan reached for the receiver without taking his eyes off the man. Engine is operational, he said, his voice steady now. Issue resolved. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to register surprise before the response came back, clipped and controlled. Stand by. The line went quiet. Around them, the crew began to move again, slower at first, then with growing purpose, resetting positions, securing equipment, preparing for the delayed operation that now had a chance to proceed. But the energy had changed. It was no longer frustration driving them. It was awareness. Ryan stepped closer to the man, lowering his voice slightly. You have worked on this class of system before, he said. It was the closest he could come to understanding. The man gave a faint, almost distant smile. Something like it, he replied. Mercer stepped forward again, not aggressive this time, but direct. I need your name, he said. The man looked at him, calm as ever. You already have what you need, he said. Mercer's expression tightened. That is not how this works. Before the exchange could continue, another voice cut across the deck, louder, carrying authority that did not need to announce itself. Lieutenant. The word alone was enough to stop movement in a 10-foot radius. Mercer turned immediately. At the far end of the deck, flanked by two officers, Admiral Richard Hayes was already walking toward them, his pace steady, his focus locked ahead. The shift was immediate. Conversation stopped. Spines straightened. The atmosphere tightened into something. Sharper, more precise. Ryan felt it before he even fully turned. The chain of command had arrived. And for reasons he could not yet explain, the man beside him did not react at all. He simply stood there, quiet, as the distance between past and present began to close. Admiral Richard Hayes did not slow as he approached, his presence cutting cleanly through the lingering noise of the deck like a line drawn in steel. Conversations died before he reached them. Tools lowered. Shoulders squared. Lieutenant Mercer snapped to attention, the motion sharp, automatic, but there was a fraction of hesitation beneath it now, something unsettled that had not been there minutes before. Sir, Mercer said, voice firm, controlled. Hayes did not respond immediately. His eyes moved past Mercer, past Ryan, landing directly on the man standing beside the open panel. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Recognition did not arrive with surprise. It arrived with certainty. That is far enough, Hayes said quietly, though no one had been moving. The words were not a command to stop action. They were a confirmation that something had already changed. Ryan felt it before he understood it. The Admiral stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the man, measuring, verifying, as if aligning memory with reality. Thomas Harlan, he said. Not a question. The name settled over the deck like weight. Ryan blinked, the pieces shifting in his mind, trying to place it, trying to understand why it sounded familiar without knowing from where. The man gave a slight nod, nothing more. It has been a while, he said. Hayes exhaled once, slow, controlled, the kind of breath that carried history behind it. Longer than it should have been, he replied. Around them, the crew remained still, caught in the gravity of an exchange they did not fully understand but could feel was not ordinary. Mercer glanced between them, confusion tightening his expression. Sir, he said carefully. This individual entered a restricted. Hayes raised a hand slightly. Mercer stopped. No force. No volume. Just enough. The Admiral's attention remained on Harlan. Why was he not brought to me immediately? He asked, his tone even, but carrying a quiet edge that did not need to rise. No one answered right away, because no one had an answer that made sense anymore. Ryan stepped forward half a pace, the responsibility settling on him before he could avoid it. Sir, we did not know who he was, he said. It was the truth. It sounded insufficient the moment it left his mouth. Hayes nodded once, acknowledging it without accepting it. His eyes shifted briefly to the open panel, then to the now steady vibration underfoot. And now you do, he said. It was not a correction. It was a statement of fact. He stepped closer to Harlan, stopping just short of formal distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the engine filled the space between them, steady, reliable, alive. Then, without hesitation, Admiral Hayes straightened and rendered a crisp, deliberate salute. It was not rushed. It was not symbolic. It was precise, practiced, and absolute. The motion froze the deck more completely than silence ever could. Ryan felt it like a physical shift, the air tightening, the meaning of it landing before his mind could fully process it. This was not recognition of rank. This was respect. Harlan did not return the salute immediately. He simply looked at Hayes, his expression unchanged, then gave a small nod, the kind that carried acknowledgment without ceremony. Only then did he raise his hand, slower, but just as exact, returning it. Around them, the crew stood motionless, every instinct telling them they were witnessing something that did not happen lightly. Mercer lowered his gaze slightly, the weight of his earlier words settling in a way that did not need correction. Ryan looked from the Admiral to Harlan, the question forming before he could stop it. "Sir, who is he?" Hayes lowered his hand, his eyes still on Harlan. "He is the reason that engine ever learned to listen in the first place," he said. The words did not explain everything, but they changed everything. No one spoke after that. The engine continued its steady rhythm beneath their feet, a deep, controlled pulse that now felt less like machinery and more like something understood, something aligned. Ryan stood there, the Admiral's words echoing in his mind, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he had been trained to trust. Systems, data, procedures, all of it had pointed one way, and yet the answer had come from somewhere else entirely. Lieutenant Mercer shifted his stance, the rigidity still there, but stripped of its earlier certainty. He glanced at Harlan again, this time not as an intruder, not even as an unknown, but as something he had failed to recognize. The weight of that realization sat heavily in his posture. "Sir," Mercer said, his voice lower now, more measured, "I was not informed of any external personnel being brought aboard." Admiral Hayes did not look at him. "He was not brought aboard," he said. "He was invited." The distinction landed quietly, but it carried implications that spread through the group like a ripple. Ryan felt it immediately. This had not been an accident. Not entirely. Hayes finally turned slightly, his gaze moving across the engineers, the open equipment, the still unsecured panel. "You were given a system that works," he said, "but you were never taught how it fails." No one answered, because they all understood the truth in that. Harlan reached forward without urgency and pressed the panel back into place, securing it with the same calm precision he had used to open it. No tools beyond the one he carried. No hesitation. Just completion. When he finished, he stepped back, as if the engine no longer required his presence. Ryan watched him closely now, noticing details he had missed before. The way he moved without wasted motion. The way he never looked rushed, even when everyone else had been. The way he listened more than he spoke. "You have seen that before," Ryan said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Harlan glanced at him, the faintest trace of acknowledgment in his expression. "More than once," he replied. The answer carried no pride, just fact. Hayes nodded slightly, as if confirming something already known. "He wrote half the field procedures you rely on," the Admiral said, "back when they were still being learned the hard way." The words settled deeper than anything before them. Ryan felt his breath slow, his perspective shifting again. This was not just experience. This was origin. Mercer straightened slightly, his voice careful now. "Sir, with respect, if that is the case, why is he not?" Hayes cut him off, not with sharpness, but with quiet finality. "Because some men do not stay where they are placed," he said. "They go where they are needed." The deck fell still again, not from command, but from understanding. Harlan adjusted the strap of his worn pouch, his gaze drifting briefly across the carrier, across the equipment, the crew, the horizon. Beyond, there was no attachment in it. No claim. Just recognition. Ryan took a step forward, compelled by something he could not quite name. "Why did you come?" he asked. Harlan looked at him for a moment, then toward the engine, now running as if it had never failed. "Because it stopped," he said. Simple. Direct. Enough. A voice crackled again over the deck communications, sharper this time, more urgent. "All stations, prepare for immediate operations." Repeat, immediate operations. The shift was instant. Crew members moved with renewed focus, positions reassigned, timelines compressed. The carrier was coming back to life in full, the delay erased by a correction no system had predicted. Hayes stepped back slightly, his role returning to command, but his attention lingered on Harlan for a fraction longer. "You should stay," the Admiral said. It was not an order. It was an offer. Harlan gave a small shake of his head. You have what you need, he said. And with that, he turned, not toward recognition, not toward acknowledgment, but toward the edge of the deck where the noise faded and the wind carried on as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. Behind him, no one tried to stop him, because now they understood. Some people were not meant to stay. They were meant to remind, and then disappear. The wind at the edge of the deck carried a different sound now, cleaner, uninterrupted, as if the carrier itself had exhaled after holding tension for too long. Thomas Harlan walked without urgency, his steps steady against the steel beneath him, the worn leather pouch resting quietly at his side. Behind him, the controlled chaos of operations resumed, but it no longer felt the same. Something had shifted, not in the machinery, in the people. Ryan Cole remained where he was for a moment longer, his eyes following Harlan's retreating figure, trying to understand something that did not fit into any system he had ever trusted. Around him, the engineers moved with purpose again, voices sharper, actions more precise. But there was a new restraint in them now. A hesitation before assumption. A pause before certainty. One of the younger technicians leaned closer to the panel, studying it again as if it might reveal something different this time. I checked that alignment 3 times, he said quietly, almost to himself. Ryan did not answer, because he had checked it too. And now that fact felt smaller than it had before. Lieutenant Mercer stood rigid for a few seconds longer before finally lowering his arms. The posture of command was still there, but it had changed shape. Less rigid, less absolute. He turned slightly toward Ryan, his voice controlled, but quieter than before. We should log the adjustment, he said. Ryan nodded slowly. We will, he replied. But neither of them moved immediately to do it, because neither of them knew how to write what had actually happened. At the far end of the deck, Admiral Hayes watched Harlan for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, then turned back toward the crew. Resume full operation, he said. The command was simple. The effect was immediate. Motion returned in full. Signals were confirmed. Systems aligned. The carrier moved forward as if nothing had interrupted it. But Hayes remained still for a second longer, his gaze lingering on the place where Harlan had been. Then he spoke again, quieter, not to the deck, but to Ryan. Do not let them forget this, he said. Ryan met his eyes, understanding settling in without explanation. No, sir, he replied. Hayes gave a single nod, then turned and walked back toward the command section, the authority of his presence folding back into the structure of the ship as naturally as it had emerged. Ryan finally looked down at the control panel again, at the smooth flow of data, at the systems now behaving exactly as they were designed to. For the first time, it did not feel like enough. He glanced back toward the edge of the deck. Harlan was almost gone now, his figure blending into the movement of personnel and equipment, becoming just another presence in a place filled with them. But Ryan knew that was not true. He took a step forward, then stopped. There was nothing to call out, nothing to ask that would change what had already been given. A seaman nearby, Eric Doyle, stood quietly, his eyes also fixed in that direction. Sir, he said softly, was he assigned here before? Ryan shook his head once. No, he said. Then after a brief pause, he added, he built the way this works. Doyle nodded slowly, the meaning settling in deeper than the words themselves. Across the deck, the engine continued its steady rhythm, no longer silent, no longer misunderstood. Ryan listened to it for a moment, really listened, the way Harlan had. Beneath the noise, beneath the vibration, there was something else now. Not sound, not data, recognition. And as the carrier moved forward into open water, no one said anything more. Because the lesson had already been given, and it did not need to be repeated. The carrier cut forward through open water, its motion steady and deliberate, the horizon stretching wide and uninterrupted ahead. The engine held its rhythm beneath the deck, a deep, consistent pulse that no longer drew attention because it no longer needed to. It simply worked. Ryan Cole stood near the control station, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the console, his eyes not on the data this time, but somewhere beyond it. The screens displayed perfection, numbers aligned, systems synchronized. Every indicator confirmed stability. And yet, for the first time in his career, Ryan understood that perfection on a screen did not always mean understanding in reality. Around him, the crew moved with renewed confidence. But there was a quietness in their efficiency now. Fewer assumptions. Fewer rushed conclusions. Even the smallest adjustments were made with a second glance, a brief pause, as if each person had learned something they could not fully explain but would not ignore again. Lieutenant Mercer approached slowly, stopping beside Ryan, his posture still disciplined, but his tone no longer sharp. "The report is ready," he said. Ryan nodded slightly. "What did you write?" Mercer hesitated for a fraction of a second, something he would not have done hours ago. "System anomaly corrected," he said. Ryan gave a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "That is not what happened," he replied. Mercer exhaled quietly. "No," he admitted. "It is not." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of that truth settling between them. Across the deck, Seaman Eric Doyle adjusted a set of tools, then paused, looking out toward the open water. "Sir," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful, "how do you train for something like that?" Ryan followed his gaze, the question lingering longer than expected. "You do not," he said finally. "You learn to recognize it when it shows up." Doyle nodded slowly, absorbing that in a way that would stay with him long after the day ended. At the far end of the carrier, Admiral Hayes stood near the command railing, looking out over the water, the wind pulling lightly at his uniform. He did not turn, but his voice carried just enough to reach the nearest officers. "Experience is not something you can install," he said. "It is something you survive long enough to earn." No one responded, because no one needed to. The meaning was already understood. Ryan took one last look at the engine housing, now sealed, quiet, unremarkable to anyone who had not been there when it failed. He stepped closer, placing his hand lightly against the metal, not to fix it, not to test it, but to feel it. For a moment, he closed his eyes, listening the way he had seen it done. The vibration was steady, consistent, alive. When he opened his eyes, he stepped back, a small shift in his posture, almost unnoticeable, but real. He would never look at the system the same way again. And somewhere beyond the structured movement of the deck, beyond the chain of command and the controlled precision of the carrier, a man walked without being followed, without being announced, without leaving anything behind except a correction that no one could fully explain. The ocean stretched endlessly around them, carrying the ship forward, carrying the lesson with it. And on that deck, among men who relied on certainty, one quiet truth settled deeper than any procedure ever could. Some knowledge is not taught. It is remembered.